Okay, let's move towards what the policy frameworks that are being developed at global scales. We will only look at global scales because at local scales, obviously, you would have to present some kind of a synthesized view. Nonetheless, broadly speaking, there are indications, of course, that a continent like Europe is much more responsive to climate issues within country and across borders, and people are more open to accepting climate change as a crisis that we are facing compared to, let's say, parts of the US where there are still lots of deniers or people who are not so happy to accept climate change despite so many evidences. And there are social science theories about why that is, that communities that faced adversity and resource limitation and rationing, for example, and so on, wars, tend to be more open to these sorts of issues than countries which haven't faced such adversities. Nonetheless, there is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that evolved in the late 80s and 90s. So UNFCCC holds what are called the Conference of the Parties. It's the main body under which the international negotiations happen, has a secretariat, has subsidiary body for implementation, and so on. So that's the administration structure. Each year it has a conference of parties that negotiate. The Kyoto Protocol came out, I think, in 1992. It create with the meeting of the parties of Kyoto Protocol. It developed one framework, for example, called Clean Development Mechanism. What is that? It basically allowed countries which were emitting a lot of greenhouse gases to offset their emissions by paying off other countries or organizations within their own country to take down that carbon. For example, with forestation by planting trees. If you fly, you could pay additional tax to contribute to tree planting. If you are a corporation, you could do that, and so on and so forth. There are lots of debates about whether CDM actually worked or not. Nonetheless, it was a concept that evolved. So you can see here there was a methodology panel, afforestation and reforestation, smaller scale CDMs. We will see in a minute what kind of projects were allowed and why it became a little bit of controversy. And accreditation was important so that you had to prove that you actually did offset your emission. So the principle was that you would take your compliance. There were Annex 1, Annex 2 countries, developed countries, or Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries like Africa, Asia, Latin America. Here you have EU, Canada, Japan. Why not US? Because US didn't sign on to it, never did. So the idea is to reduce their emission by using technology and other credit processes, invest in non-Annex 1 countries, and trigger their development. So obviously, philosophically speaking, the question always is whether economic development whether it can act as a tool for reducing climate impact. This some people don't agree, as I mentioned before about Herman Daly, for example. You can read up his work, very nice work. Does CDM work or does it encourage more emission? That's the big question. So the kind of projects allowed included energy industries, manufacturing, energy demand, so reducing energy demand, waste handling and disposal, transportation, afforestation, chemical industries. So the people who didn't believe that it worked obviously said that the CDM only encouraged more economic activity and did not actually reduce overall emissions, and we know that the emissions have only been going up. But there was actually a clause in there that says you have to prove additionality, which means, let's say you did agroforestry as a clean development mechanism where agriculture is mixed with trees. Trees are supposed to give you better groundwater recharge, more soil moisture persistence, drought resilience, reduce evaporation, provide protection against winds, provide non-rainy season income, lots of co-benefits of doing that. But you had to show that by doing agroforestry, you in fact sequestered more carbon into the soil and the trees than you would have if you just did agriculture. So there is a heavy monitoring required. World Bank has a program on tracking carbon sequestration, additional carbon sequestration by agroforestry, right? So, and there is a lot of debate about whether mature forests can take up carbon, whether tropical forests can keep the carbon if there is a lot of disturbances. So we will look at another tool called reduce the emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Okay, so these are the policy frameworks within which action is being tried. So it's always a battle between economic growth, reducing emissions, improving standards of living, and still reducing total emissions. Not an easy task, but this is a process that will go on for some time, hopefully before it's too late. Already some people claim it's too late, but as you remember we talked in the first chapter, that's related to the warming observed being almost linearly proportional to the total accumulated carbon. So if you know that the target you want to hit, then you can calculate how much more carbon we have left to emit before we're getting there. And taking the current rates of emission every year, people tend to calculate how many years we have left to get there and claim we have only 7 years or we have only 13 years left to save the world. There are many counter arguments saying setting such deadlines is not a good idea, and I tend to agree with that. But that's a separate debate. Nonetheless, policy frameworks have to take everything from carbon emissions, change in climate, climate impacts, reducing climate impacts via these tools implemented by agreed upon policies.